What motivated me to make this video was a couple comments I saw on my last Indiana Jones The Great Circle video the other day, where we looked at the new FSR 3 update and path tracing on my RX 7900 XTX. Some were saying that path tracing doesn't make a difference in this game, or that it doesn't look good. While I disagree, why not put it to the test and take a closer look? My playthrough of the game has been with path tracing enabled pretty much, so I wanted to look at the differences more closely out of my own curiosity. The footage was captured using an RTX 4090 at 4K with DLSS quality at 60 FPS. We're going to focus on the Thailand area of the game because it's the level that I'm at, and look at different scenarios: indoors, nighttime, and daytime. Now, let's get one thing clear and be completely honest here. This game looks amazing, even without the path tracing. As a matter of fact, it does use ray trace global illumination by default, and the game is very scalable. It's a very good looking game. Path tracing and all the other ray tracing effects that this game has, which we'll go over, just takes things to another level. And in some cases, it may not be as noticeable, while in others, it's very noticeable. I'd say in this cutscene, for example, the effects are very subtle. With path tracing disabled, you see the forest canopy shadows going over the characters, and they're way too pronounced. They should be a lot more diffused than that. And if we put them side by side with path tracing off on the left and path tracing on the right, you can see how the shadows are a lot better diffused with path tracing enabled. There are other minor differences as well, like indirect illumination, but it's not really all that noticeable. So I would say the better diffused shadows definitely make the scene a bit more realistic looking, but I classify this as being rather subtle, although we're going to see how much better the shadows can look with path tracing overall.
Relax. We're on your side.
We'll start inside the hotel with path tracing disabled, and this is a good opportunity to check out the latest update, which added full ray traced shadows. Especially indoors, the shadows weren't ray traced, and right now the shadows, I'd say, look pretty decent. We have the see-through curtains casting pretty decent shadow, and also the windows, although it does look a bit rough and not properly diffused. If we throw path tracing on, now they look more accurate and about what you'd expect as the shadow distance increases. If we move up on the second floor, you can see here without path tracing we have a mirror at the bottom next to the door, and then the door, and a pretty dimly lit hallway. But is that accurate? Well, let's turn on path tracing, and now the scene looks a bit more brightly lit, and we also have reflections on the mirror, but also the materials as well become reflective, which also changes how the lighting behaves. The game has some pretty decent looking screen space reflections. As you can see, we can see Gina and the end of the hallway on the mirror without any ray trace reflections. As the hallway disappears from the camera view though, we now have a pretty dull looking mirror with cube map fallback. Now compare that to having ray trace reflections enabled on the right, and you can clearly see how much better it looks. We can now see what's behind us in this very old and dirty looking mirror. We can also see Indy, actually, Indy's reflection, although it is a bit smudged up because I believe it's supposed to be an old looking mirror. And I believe that's intentional because this game does have full resolution reflections on clean glass. I've seen it myself. The examples I showed you guys were rather subtle. Let's look at this fishing village at night first, and then we'll also look at it during the day because it's very transformative here. We're in a pretty small bamboo fishing village in Thailand, and it's night outside with a bright, big full moon and a starry sky. And as you can see, the lights pouring into this cabin with open doors and windows. And this is without path tracing. Now, if we throw path tracing on, you'll see how those reflections add so much more depth to the bamboo floor, which as a result, it bounces light across the room. Now you can also see the Buddha hanging on the wall. It adds a lot more depth with accurate shadow casting because the moon's behind us. Whereas previously, it looked pretty dull. You could even miss it and not even see it. Whereas now it's properly illuminated by the surrounding light and also accurate shadow casting based off the distance that it's off the wall. Ray trace reflections have come a really long way, and it used to be shiny puddles or mirrored glass, but if you apply the right reflective properties to different materials, like this bamboo village, for example. It adds so much immersion to the scene because you can see the sky's reflections and then the light bounces over the surroundings, and it just looks very good and very immersive. Although the game without path tracing still looks very good, but I do believe that path tracing takes it to a whole other level. What do you guys think? Now, let's quickly touch over the shadows, because shadows mixed with reflections can also be quite transformative, because we have a lot of ray trace effects here. Global illumination, shadows, reflections. We have subsurface scattering on foliage, which we're going to touch on in a little bit. You can see how much the tree shadows stand out without path tracing enabled all over this village. And the trees are so far away, the shadows should not be that intrusive. But path tracing fixes all that. If we flick it on, all of a sudden we get a lot more accurate shadows. The objects that are closest to the building, sure, have more defined, but still diffuse shadows, whereas the trees are so far away, they should not be casting shadows the way that they were. So yeah, that is a pretty nice improvement. This is another example of how intrusive, inaccurate shadows can be without path tracing, but you'll see once we throw path tracing on and turn everything on, we'll get better reflections with the bamboo. It'll reflect the night sky, but also the pottery. A lot of the materials here have reflective properties that are very accurate once path tracing is enabled. Here you can see without path tracing, the trees again are casting very, very defined and intrusive shadows. But look at the roof as well, because once we throw path tracing on, we still have very defined shadows now. On the roof, they're a lot more defined because they're very close to the surface. It's what you would expect. So is the railing, but the trees are so far away that they are still casting shadows, just that they're very, very diffused. I have one more nighttime example before we look at the daytime, because it'll be interesting to see how things change if they do at all. But without path tracing, you can see how dull this looks. And the banners look like stickers, but throw path tracing on, and now you can see how that bamboo reflects the sky behind it. But also the banners themselves now have accurate shadows and ambient occlusion. But you can also see that some of the threads on the banners as well have reflective properties that makes them stand out. Well, it's now daytime, and we're looking at that same exact wall we were just looking at. We have path tracing disabled, and the game still looks really good. Again, if you look at those banners, they look like stickers. There's no depth to them. But if we throw path tracing on, look at that transformation. That is even bigger than during the nighttime. We have the bamboo reflecting the sky behind us, but also the banners now have depth. You can even see the way that they're hanging and which way they're tilted. That is really, really cool and very, very transformative. I didn't think it would be as big of a noticeable difference, but it is. Now, if we move inside, things can change a little bit because, again, we have a lot of reflective surfaces here that can cause light to bounce in and out. And with path tracing enabled, it looks really, really good. Everything looks like it's got depth, but if we turn it off, it still looks great, but not nearly as good or as realistic as it did with path tracing enabled. I mean, am I crazy? You guys let me know down in the comment section. We'll look at two more examples here in this same cabin, and as you can see, that is a very, very tall tree without path tracing. Again, we have very pronounced shadows. It looks good, but if we turn on path tracing, it does diffuse those leaves pretty nicely, and they're still moving as well. And we do have very pronounced shadows with objects that are very close to the surfaces. We have a very similar situation here with path tracing disabled. We have very pronounced shadows from the trees around us, but also the garage here. it looks unusually bright inside. And of course, once we enable path tracing, well, you see it add more depth and realism to the lighting. Now let's take a look at full ray traced subsurface scattering on foliage. What the heck is that, I hear you say? Well, it's supposed to simulate light passing through and illuminating semi-transparent surfaces, like foliage, plants, and leaves. Only applies to foliage, unfortunately, in this game. I wish it would apply to like tents and cloth and other materials, but it's still pretty cool. Right now we have path tracing disabled. If we enable path tracing, you'll see the sunlight illuminate the plants, and it looks really, really cool. Now this applies to all leaves and plants in the game, and it looks really cool. It's just another addition to the whole path tracing package that uplifts the visual fidelity in this game quite a bit. This scene here captures it really well. With path tracing disabled, of course, it looks really, really good. But we enable path tracing, and now you see all the effects come together and make the scene look so much more realistic. I mean, it's not just the leaves that are illuminating with the sunlight, but it's also the river. It's also the actual straw in the roof that is reflecting light properly. And then you also have the tree and the leaves casting very, very pronounced shadows because they're really close to the roof with path tracing and ray trace shadows. In all honesty, I didn't think there would be as big of a noticeable difference during the day. I mean, the way that sun bathes the forest with path tracing enabled, it just captures that Indiana Jones movies Kodak stock Panavision camera. Hard to explain, but that rich color and the image just pops. It's very nice. I quite like it. I think this level overall lends itself very well to the effects of path tracing. Unlike some other levels, like Egypt in the sand, for example, the effects weren't all that noticeable, but my mind was kind of blown. If you look at the tree roots on the left and the grass on top of it, it looks pretty nice with the game's own RTGI, but turn on full ray tracing and the amount of depth and realism that is applied to what was already on screen, it's really fascinating. And before we wrap it up, I wanted to show you guys another really good example of the full ray trace subsurface scattering on foliage. If you look at the palm leaves, once we turn on path tracing, you can see even though they're in the shadow, they are being hit by the sun, especially the back ones. And you can see some of the petals glow with that yellowish green glow from the sun. It's really cool technology. But yeah, guys, to go back to what motivated me to make this video, people that say path tracing looks the same in Indiana Jones or that it's not noticeable, I think they must be seeing what they want to see. Now, if someone said they don't think it's worth the performance cost or compromises they'd have to make to use it, I can respect that, and it even makes sense. Speaking for myself though, I do love the cutting edge of visual fidelity and technology. One of the biggest joys of getting a new GPU growing up and right now is to play games that used to struggle and max out the graphics. With a game as scalable as this though, packing as much of the latest visual tech as this, it's better for the game's preservation in the long run because you can play this game on an Xbox Series S, it looks great, and it scales all the way to some of the latest, most powerful hardware accordingly. The game is better for having all these options. Leave your thoughts down below though and let me know what you think. I do appreciate you guys watching and sharing your feedback with me, and if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it. And subscribe to see more videos like this, or benchmarks of new games, CPU comparisons, or whatever I happen to find interesting at the time. Anyway though, I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace!
You doing okay?
I'm just not used to this.
Don't worry. I know how to drive this thing.